Welcome to Your Leadership Matters by Odgers Berndtson, a series diving into pivotal career moments and high-stakes decisions. Each episode, one of Canada's top business leaders will share personal reflections about critical moments in their career.
Hello, I'm Collin MacLeod, partner and head of the healthcare practice at Odgers Berndtson, Canada, and I'm thrilled to have Dr. Ronald Cohn join us today. Dr. Cohn is the president and CEO for the Hospital for Sick Children, affectionately known as SickKids, Canada's most research-intensive hospital, and the largest center dedicated to improving children's health in the country. After receiving his medical degree in Germany, he practiced medicine at Johns Hopkins in Boston, where he began as the first combined resident in pediatrics and genetics, and became the director of the world's first multidisciplinary center for hypotonia, earning national and international recognition. In 2012, Dr. Cohn moved to Toronto to join SickKids as the chief of the Division of Clinical and Metabolic Genetics, co-director of the Center of Genetic Medicine, and senior scientist at the SickKids Research Institute. Ronnie, welcome.
Thank you, Collin, for having me. Good to see you.
You moved into the role of CEO in 2019, and while not uncommon, you're still a practicing physician and a researcher. Tell us about that move, and why did you want to take that step in your career?
I had no idea that I would ever want to take a step like this in my career, nor even, to be honest, had the ambition to become a CEO of a hospital. And I guess there has been some kind of evolution in my life. After I finished training at Johns Hopkins and joined the faculty, my chair was asking me, are you interested potentially in leadership roles? And I never really actively thought about it, but I thought, why don't I explore this? And became the director of the genetic residency program there. And I realized how much I enjoyed being in a position to change things, to have influence and have impact, mentor people, dealing with problems. I think it's really important as a leader, no matter where you are in the world, you need to love to deal with problems because people always come with a problem to you. So anyway, I enjoyed that quite a lot, and then I was recruited as the head of genetics here to SickKids, where I really had a much broader leadership role, more impact. My chair used to say, how big of a canvas do you want to paint on? That's the question you need to ask yourself, and I thoroughly enjoyed myself, and then I had the opportunity to apply for the chair of pediatrics and chief of pediatrics here at SickKids and the University of Toronto, and I was privileged to get that role after a few years being the head of genetics. And I'll tell you honestly, at that point I felt like I reached the pinnacle of my career. I loved this role. I always wanted to have a broader impact on pediatric health and pediatric care for children, and in that role also being able to mentor a lot of young faculty members. I thought I have reached everything I ever wanted to reach. And then our previous CEO moved back to the United States, and the board chair came to me and asked me, I think you should apply for the CEO role. And my immediate reaction was, under no circumstances. Because I do not want to lose, and I cannot lose my identity as a physician and a scientist. Then he looked at me and said, why would you have to lose that identity? And he said, why don't you take some time to think about whether this could actually be an interesting role for you? And then I started a process of several weeks of trying to think about, so what could this look like, being the CEO of a hospital, and what kind of impact could I potentially have trying to come up with a vision that would provide children with a better health care, and how to implement this vision. And I will tell you that my wife put this best. When I initially spoke to her about it and to get her advice, she said, you know, Ronnie, when you became chief of pediatrics and chair of pediatrics, you put on a suit, it fit you, and you were just running with it. And what you have to go through now is thinking about, can you tailor yourself a suit for that role too? So I began to think about what would be possible if I had that role. What could I think about? What could I do? And after about 5.5 weeks, we took a walk with our dog, and I shared some of my ideas with her, how I was thinking about this and that. And then she looked at me and said, "I think you're choosing the color of your suit already." And literally that was the time when I said, okay, now I'm going to apply for this role. And again, I was privileged enough to get the role. And I remember a few months in thinking, wow, I would not have thought that I enjoy this role so much. And despite all the challenges, I guess we're going to talk about some of those, I have thoroughly and continue to thoroughly enjoy this role.
Thinking how research intensive and how specialized the care is at SickKids, how have you found that your continued work as a clinician and as a scientist has helped you establish credibility, and how have you leveraged that credibility as CEO?
I probably want to be fair and start by saying I kind of underestimated and didn't even think about that it could provide me some credibility. I wanted to continue to be a physician because I wanted to do it. I wanted to keep my research going because I'm passionate about it and I wanted to do it. And I only realized over time that actually for a few weeks out of the year, being on the front line in clinical care and experience the problems that we often just talk about among colleagues or senior management team or with our directors, was not only incredibly helpful to me, but was, in fact, like you said, appreciated by the staff, that they actually see that I understand what we are talking about when we talk about challenges. And I think it's similarly true for my research colleagues who appreciate the fact that I continue to try to do science, that I think about science. And with that comes obviously a very genuine appreciation of science. I'm saying genuine because I think you don't have to be a scientist, you don't have to be a physician in order to have credibility among your team. But if you do it, there's a kind of a different level of appreciation that you can provide. And have been surprised about this over the time, how much it actually is beneficial for others too, not just for my own mental health.
When you think about those three intersecting but different and dynamic roles, physician, clinician, researcher, hospital CEO, how do you balance and find the balance in terms of being successful in those three key areas?
I mean, at the end of the day, it comes down to being organized, having a certain skill of prioritizing what is important. And I would lie to you if I don't say I obviously have to work very hard. So, I start my mornings very early, usually before I start meetings, and I would say between 5:30 and 8 o'clock. That's the time where I often spend on research or other things that I usually don't have time during the day. And for example, when I'm on clinical service, I prioritize my roles as a CEO as really doing only the things that have to be done. What that leads to is that usually a week before and a week after I'm on clinical service, I'm usually a bit more busy, but that's okay. I take that into account. I plan for it. So it really, at the end of the day, comes down to prioritizing, being organized, and maybe the most important fact that I haven't said is you need to be passionate about it. When I'm on call, I love it. And so it's not like a burden to me, but it's just an added joy to what I usually do.
Having spent time in Canada, the US, and Germany, how do you compare those systems, and what do you see as the differences?
I guess we could spend probably an hour just talking about the differences, but I would say, particularly comparing these three systems, None of them are perfect, but I will say, coming from a universal healthcare perspective, let's not call it a system because I'm not quite sure here in Canada we have as much of a universal healthcare system as we more have a perspective, because not everything is really universal. I think provides you a landscape within the healthcare system that is really in principle geared towards patients and families and trying to support. So I will say that coming from the United States to Canada and not having conversations with families about whether the visit to my outpatient clinic is covered or whether the patient's visit to the emergency room is covered through an insurance, because many people don't have it covered, takes off a huge amount of burden. And I think it's a privilege for us healthcare providers to not have to think about some of the very basic principles which are often an issue in the United States. Is our system perfect? Not nearly. And I think we have seen this over the last few years, that there are lots and lots of efficiencies that we probably need to find. And there are lots of areas where certain areas of healthcare, because some areas are much better covered than others. So pediatrics is being an area that we have learned for many years, and it has just exploded throughout the pandemic as an area that has been undersized for decades and decades, and that needs to be now right-sized, taking into account to create a system all across the spectrum of the life of a child that is efficient and provides access to all children. So that's the challenge for the next few years, to think about how to do that.
It sounds like your time in Canada these last 10 plus years now has changed some of that perspective. Has the role as CEO changed your perspective on the system as well?
100%. I think in my role as a CEO, I have visibility and opportunities to get insights from a systems level like in no other role I had before. I would say as the chief of pediatrics, I was getting a glimpse of what the children's healthcare system in the GTA in Ontario looks like, in Canada looks like. But I think in the current role, you really get a deep insight and you understand what's working, what's not working. And that is part of what I enjoy about my role. You identify these problems, and then in my role, I have an opportunity to work with colleagues inside and outside to think about, so what can we do to make it better?
Let's talk about SickKids. You'd mentioned when we started talking about this that you're on an ambitious journey in terms of transforming clinical care. And coincidentally, I heard someone, I hope I'm not stealing your tagline, but I heard someone mention genetic code to postal code this week. Tell us about that transformation.
I would love to tell you about it because I'm incredibly passionate about it, and it actually goes back to my time as a resident at Johns Hopkins. During my time there, I used to spend every Friday afternoon about an hour with one of our very senior geneticists called Berndtson, whom very few people actually know outside of Johns Hopkins, who was the father of the idea of what it means to provide individualized healthcare. And I remember sitting there in his office for years every Friday, listening just to his theories and becoming passionate about it. And I've taught it at Johns Hopkins. I came to SickKids, started to teach the concept here. And it was probably the main reason, Collin, why I became interested in this role as CEO, feeling like we have an opportunity here at an institutional level and then outside the walls to change the way how we take care of children. And that's behind the idea of precision child health. And what it really means is moving from this one-size-fits-all approach that we all practice to about probably 90% in medicine, to a very individual patient approach that takes into account the unique characteristics of each child and their family. And thank you for mentioning the tagline, because it is, in my mind, the differentiator between us and many other institutions who talk and do a lot around precision medicine, but probably don't do it in the holistic approach that we are trying to target this. And the way how we are approaching this is, yes, there's a lot of knowledge that we have and that we are beginning to even increase in terms of genetic data in a child. But if you look at the whole spectrum of data, physiological data, other biological data, the one piece that is often missed being integrated is around the postal code. And what does that really mean? It's not just where does a child live, but what are the social determinants of health behind a child and their family? What is the income situation? What's the environmental exposure to children where they live? And only if you take this and then integrate it with all the other physiological and biological genetic data, then you are in a position to really think about the unique, individualized care. And that's what we really want to do. Because at the end of the day, if we begin to do this, leveraging data, leveraging artificial intelligence and machine learning, we will really find ourselves in a position to diagnose faster, treat smarter, but also predict better. And the prediction is the other piece that I think is so critical here. Try to identify a problem ahead of time, and not after going through a series of standard of care approaches that may work for 80%, but not for 20%, identifying these 20% from the get-go and give them streamlined diagnostic and treatment approach. So this is the vision, and we are actually well on our way already. And it has been one of the most exciting, gratifying professional experiences that I'm in a privileged position to help influence and shape this vision and bring it to life with my colleagues all across the hospital.
And hearing you talk about that, the personal connection to that vision and mission is palpable. How do you harness or hone in thinking about the role of you as a scientist in this mission versus you as the executive sponsor and the CEO having to sort of drive a transformation forward that no one person will obviously ultimately lead?
Yeah, so I think being the scientist or the clinician in this role is providing me a natural understanding of the problem that I've outlined to you, because I live it. But being in an executive leadership role provides me the unique opportunity to identify talent within the organization, try to convince, or not necessarily convince, maybe the wrong word here, but try to engage and get them excited the same way how I'm excited about it, and then really create a team of talented people who will help implement this vision. This is an institutional movement that in the end is going to require everyone to rally behind, but in order to really implement transformational change, you need a team of people who not only believe in this, because I know I can be very compelling and passionate about it, but I need people who are willing to work with me to actually make it happen. And as a CEO, I am in a fortunate role to look at everybody here at the organization and see, oh my God, this is an amazing person. And we are blessed with so many incredibly talented people at all levels, not just scientists, physicians. We have nurses, we have operational directors. We have lots and lots of people who are part of this, because it has to be at all levels throughout the institution in order to really change something on a transformational level.
So when you think about that kind of transformation, and if you look back over your career, I'm sure there's a number of pivotal roles or moments that have influenced the success you're now having. What would be a couple of those that most come to mind in terms of those most influential sort of impression points?
Maybe I need to go back to medical school because when I started medical school, I thought I wanted to be a trauma surgeon because I was working in the emergency room in Germany, and there was a trauma surgeon who I just admired, and I thought he was the coolest guy, and I wanted to be just like him. And then our closest friends had a boy who pretty much stopped developing after the age of 3 months. He went to the Children's Hospital then in Germany, and he was diagnosed back then, which was called like a mitochondrial myopathy. And my friend called me and said, "What is this? Have you heard about it?" I was a second-year medical student. I hadn't heard about it. There was no internet. I had to look it up in a dictionary. Didn't really make much sense what I read. And that was the moment when I decided I wanted to be a pediatric neurogeneticist. So that was the biggest pivotal moment in terms of my area of interest and now my area of expertise. But then after that, I'm not sure it would be fair to identify one or two pivotal moments, because I had lots of important decisions to make along the way. I give you an example. When I wrote my medical thesis in Germany, which is not like a PhD thesis in North America, it's more like usually retroactive, a little bit of research, but not as rigorous, I would say. It was the only piece of science that I did that I never published because it was pretty much awful. And I realized, okay, that cannot be science, what I did here, and I wanted to do research and told my professor, where can I do research? And so he suggested I go to Iowa City to Dr. Campbell, and that was a big decision in my life that I, for the first time in my life, did real bench-type research. And then I had to make a decision of, am I going to go back to Germany? I'm going to stay in North America. And we made a family decision, mostly personal decision, to stay in the United States. And I ended up at Johns Hopkins being the first, you said in the beginning, the first pediatric genetic combined resident. And I knew I was somewhat of a trial object because I've never done it, but I felt like it's a great opportunity. I tried. So along the lines of my career, I had many of those moments, and I think it would be unfair to pick one out except the one with when I decided to become a pediatrician and neurogeneticist.
I've heard lots of physician leaders talk about the fact that we don't necessarily teach management at med school. And so I wonder if, as you sort of found yourself going into more leadership roles, if something stands out where you really gravitated to that, said, the notion of that accountability for not just my own work, but the work of a program really stood out to you.
I do think that goes back to my first leadership role as the program director in genetics at Johns Hopkins. And I figured out early on that I really love to think about a visionary change. So I'll be very honest with you, I'm not necessarily an incredibly detailed operational lead. One of my coaches in the past has said, you are only detailed when it really matters most. Then you go into the weeds, otherwise you let your team do this, which is the way how I think it should be. But back then, I was thinking about combining our training program at Johns Hopkins with the National Institute of Health, which was only 45 minutes away. And I thought, instead of competing about residents, let's create one program, get all of our assets together, and create something bigger and better. It was hard work. It was really a lot of political stuff too, but I enjoyed that type of work. And that, I think, was kind of the confirmation to me that I love being in a privileged position of trying to think about change and putting in the work to bring change, because obviously you can have a great idea and then sit back and hope others are going to make it happen. That's not how it works. And I found that out early on too.
You moved into the role of president and CEO in 2019. Less than a year later, we all know what happens, March of 2020, and the world really truly does change. As a new CEO, not new to your organization, but new to that role, how did you navigate the impact of COVID?
I think I navigated it based on two principles. One is, and again, it's going back to a coaching session I had, I think it was 2 weeks after the pandemic was officially declared. And this person was sitting in front of me and asking, I think more out of curiosity than out of coaching reasons, what do you think your role is right now for the hospital during this pandemic? And I had to think about it. She said, you have only a minute to think about your answer. So I probably spent 45 to 50 seconds thinking about it. And I said to her, I think I'm the captain of the ship right now who needs to make sure that we can get through this storm in a steady and calm way. And she looked at me and said, I wish you all the best, because if you can do that, then your organization will appreciate you for that. Take that together with, honestly, the most amazing senior management team that somebody in my role can hope for. This is what got us through the pandemic, because, as you know, things had to change so many times over, sometimes within a week, sometimes even within a day, and there was no end to challenges. Right? And I don't use the word lightly, because generally I feel challenges are opportunities, but we had a lot of challenges that we had to deal with. But I also felt like this is a test for me. I need to show a certain amount of leadership and calm to my organization. And then working with an incredible team that was dedicated to make sure that we get through this in a good way. That got us through the pandemic in, I think, one of the best possible ways.
In looking back, did you lean into the clinical, the medical side of your experience, or was that a time to let the doctors be doctors and really focus on being the CEO and leading the organization, or can you differentiate the two?
I don't think you can differentiate this. From a practical point of view, did I continue to do my calls on the floor? Yes, I did. But there's no switch that goes on and off when I'm not clinically practicing. It's obviously always in my mind. And of course, it's helpful if you have a clinical background when you're dealing with a new disease that everybody on the planet is trying to figure out, and I have the ability to read a scientific paper or a clinical paper that is important with a slightly different background than others. And I think just in the process of knowledge translation and accumulating knowledge, having the clinical background made it often easier for me maybe to understand than some others who had to maybe talk to a colleague to get it explained. What is a vasculitis? Is vasculitis really part of COVID or not? And having the scientific background obviously helps you to identify, is this a good designed research study or is this an over-interpreted research study? So I think it's just it's really important for me to have and everybody else is part of who I am, and I need to make sure that people understand that.
When you reflect over your career, and certainly thinking about the last 4 years, how do you feel that healthcare leadership has changed? And how do you see it continuing to change?
I think a lot of leaders in healthcare talked previously a lot about going together, collaborating. The pandemic has almost forced us to do that in a real, genuine way, like I think never before. The way how we have collaborated as institutions, as different programs, as people throughout the pandemic in order to manage some of these crises, I think has been one of the spectacular silver linings of the pandemic. And I will tell you, a lot of that has persisted. Because I think one can make the argument, if you are constantly under high adrenaline, there is a certain way how you behave, how you are open to certain things that you're generally not so open to. But I think we have also deeply appreciated the fact that many things you just do better together than alone. That in my mind, the appreciation of that and the appreciation that's resulting from that in terms of if we do things together, we are making things better for our own hospital, but we can make things better for the system. I think that was the biggest change and continues to be a big change.
I often get asked what I think are the most important traits in leaders, and I actually don't remember what the answer was pre-COVID, but now it's always empathy, right? I think as a leader in healthcare, if you lead and that's grounded in empathy, along with many other things, but that empathetic approach in terms of how you look at your own organization and how it fits into the broader system, we're in good shape.
I 100% agree.
What do you think the next generation of healthcare leaders needs to focus on to support the current healthcare system in Canada and what that system will look like 10 or 20 years into the future?
Look, it's hard to actually really predict what the system is going to look like in the future, but one thing is pretty much clear to me. We are just beginning to scratch the surface of how we're going to utilize data and how we're going to utilize technology to use the data we have to improve patient care. That's just going to, at some point, it's going to explode. It's still very slowly happening. And that is going to change the way how we provide care for our patient. And I think the biggest change here will be that we really will limit the time for patients to be in the hospital versus being monitored by the hospital at home, and trying to make sure that we really have only the sickest of the sickest coming to a hospital and try to make sure that otherwise people can stay at home. I think to me that is one of the biggest changes that needs to happen, and that I think will happen. It's just a matter of, are we going to all realize it and make it happen quickly, or are we going to putter around and it's going to take more time than it should? I think the other change I would really love to see, and I guess with me saying it like this, you feel like you get the sense that I'm not convinced that we can get there, but we need to. We really need to think much more about preventative healthcare aspects to make sure that people don't get to a certain point of where they don't need to be. And I'm not necessarily talking about preventing disease altogether, but if we can create an overall healthier population with really good access early on to family practitioners or pediatricians, I think our entire society will benefit from this. That is going to require a huge shift in thinking, because right now we need what do people think about when we talk about preventative health care? Well, they used to think about vaccinations. That have become a little bit more of a problem recently too, but it's these kind of things, and maybe healthy eating and some of these basic principles, but there is so much more to this. And again, it's going to require systems collaborations. This is not for the healthcare system alone to solve. This is going to require us working with schools and many other parts of society. But these are the big changes that need to happen, and obviously that needs to be embraced by the next generation of leaders. And we will, since I'm still here and my colleagues are still here, we'll try our best to set everything up that this can happen in the longer-term future.
As my final question, I wanted to ask, what's the best piece of advice you've ever received, and who did it come from?
I can't answer this, and I'll tell you why. Very early on in my career, I realized I need lots and lots of mentors for different aspects of where I felt like I want to develop. There I had clinical mentors, research mentors, career mentors, leadership mentors. And it's something I teach my students or residents or give advice to other colleagues. Don't try to identify one or two people who give you advice. Create an army of people who can help you with a certain skill set. And within those, I could give you an example for each one of these people. When I give a lecture about this, I usually show a picture with 10 faces because I had and continue to have lots and lots of mentors. But at the end of the day, to answer your question in a different way, what really has allowed me to flourish in my career and take on the challenges that I had to take on is my family. It's not just my wife, we were talking about earlier, who gave me obviously and continues to give me great advice, but it's the healthy basis of a family that provides you and keeps you grounded. And from there you can just spread your wings if you have the opportunity, and it always comes back to that.
So maybe I'll cheat and ask one more question and build off this in a different way. If we think about those next leaders, the unit managers that are thinking about maybe becoming a director one day, or what puts them on that course, or the division head who thinks about being a chief, if you were going to be one of those 10 faces on a group of people offering them advice, what would be your advice to today's group of emerging medical leaders?
Be willing to embrace change. Have a vision for that change. Strive for excellence. And be compassionate and empathetic with your team and the members of your team in order to make this change happen. I think that's what I would say. And from a very practical point of view, I mentioned that a little bit earlier, you need to love to solve problems. People come to you every single day with asking you for advice with a problem. Sometimes they want you to solve the problem for them, and then you need to find a way to make sure you solve it together. But sometimes they just want advice. And if that is something that doesn't really resonate with you, that you don't really enjoy, then maybe that's not for you.
I think great advice to all of us. Roddy, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank
I really
you,
appreciate
Collin.
it, the opportunity to have the conversation.
Thank you, Collin, for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Your Leadership Matters is brought to you by Odgers Berndtson Canada, a premier integrated leadership advisory firm working to place and develop great leaders. You can find this and other episodes on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts.